Okay, so I originally thought we would finish Job with this session, but actually, I think whilst we'll have kind of almost got to the end of the book tonight, I thought when I was like preparing for this session that it would be good if we did a session next week, really kind of summing up some of the main things that we've learned and seen, allowing you guys to have a little bit of feedback about what you've seen there, and whether it's changed your views or thoughts or whatever, and really kind of try and wrap the whole thing up. So I'm actually going to leave the last chapter of Job until next week. That gives us a little bit more time to look at what God says as he comes on the scene, because he doesn't come on the scene until the end, although Elihu, as we remember, says that he's speaking under inspiration from the Holy Spirit. So just to remind us where we kind of got to in the last session, it was Elihu speaking, and he kind of leads in to how God is going to approach Job. And so there's three things that we kind of summarized at the end of the last session. And the first one thing was this, that when we come to God, we come on his terms and not ours. And what I mean by that is that we don't come to God, and people can't come to God, and even in Job's time couldn't come to God on the basis of their own goodness. Because compared to Jesus or compared to God, we're not very good at all. So if we try and relate to God and come to him and try and impress him with our own goodness and our own achievements and so on, then that actually isn't the way that people can approach God. But if we come in humility, wanting to be taught of God and receive his understanding, and actually God's very gracious, he's very tolerant, he kind of cuts through all our failings, all our mistakes, all our messes, and he speaks into our lives. But the basic principle is he responds in his way, and we don't dictate to him how we want him to respond. So that was one thing that we looked at last time. And the second one is when we I think the words, when we rail against God, when we blame him for things, when we say, God, you've got to hear me, I'm going to justify myself before you, and so on. And when we start going around blaming God and getting angry with him things, that means that we've lost sight of who we are, and we've lost sight of who he is. Because when we judge him by our own view of righteousness and our own standards of righteousness, and blame him for bad things, then it just proves that we don't really know him, because he's a good God who wants our best interests. And then where we finished off in the last session was that Elihu says that the reason why you can think like this, and the reason why that's true, is that when we blame God for injustice, or when we blame him for the bad things in our lives, it's because we've forgotten the evidence. And if you remember, I said last time, well, so what evidence? What evidence is he talking about? And he actually tells us, and he says, here's the evidence that God is a good God, and he wants good things for you. And the evidence is creation. And what he says is it's our lack of thankfulness and our lack of being able to see God's goodness around us that's a big problem for our hearts. And because we're not thankful, because we don't see God's goodness around us as evidenced by creation, it affects our ability to relate very well to him. And that's where we finished off in the last session. And really, what I said then was that, why does he start talking about creation? What's so big about that? And it is so big because actually what we're going to find out is that that's the basis that God's going to talk to Job as well. And we looked at that passage, didn't we, from Romans chapter 1, where he talks about how men exchange the glory of creation and for man-made things, man-made views, and start worshipping the creature rather than the creation. We looked at how that relates to atheistic thinking in our day. So that's where we got to. So now we get to chapter 38. So open your Bibles, chapter 38 of Job. And I'll start at verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he says this, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man, for now I'm going to question you, and you're going to answer me. Now, what's the import of that? Well, Elihu's done this big introduction. God comes on the scene, and God's come on the scene, and the approach he takes is, I'm going to settle this dispute now between you bunch of friends, you people that have sat there discussing me and discussing all these problems in Job's life. But I'm not going to settle this the way you want me to settle it. I'm going to settle it my way. And what does that mean? Well, Job wanted God to come on the scene and prove that Job was really a good man by giving some other explanation for his afflictions. So that's what Job wanted. And then his friends, Eliphaz, Zophar and Bildad, they wanted God to come on the scene, and they wanted him to prove them right and show how bad Job really was and how he was covering everything up in his life. And God comes along and he says, this is what the situation is. None of you know what you're talking about. And I'm going to talk. I'm now going to talk, because I've had to sit here listening to you, and now I'm going to come and explain a few things to you, because you don't come to me wanting me to prove you right. This isn't a test. I come to you to show you that I'm right, that I'm good, that I am who I say I am, that I'm a good God and I care about you. So I'm going to come and show you that I'm right. You want me to prove to you that you're right, but I'm going to come and show you that I'm right. And it says the Lord answered him out of a whirlwind. Well, why is that interesting? Well, it is interesting. And the reason it's interesting is that in the Old Testament, there are numerous occasions where God's presence comes to people, and it's associated with a whirlwind. And so what he's saying is they have the actual physical manifest presence of God. And that is who he's speaking, the actual physical manifest presence of God. So they're not hearing this. This isn't like vague impressions in their heart. It's not kind of stuff that they could get wrong or dream up or misinterpret. It's actually God himself, and he's on the scene. So you remember people like Elijah, God came down in a whirlwind and took him up to heaven. In Psalms, God's presence is often talked about as a whirlwind. Jeremiah talks about God's coming as a whirlwind, and God appears to Ezekiel in a whirlwind. So there is various instances where the manifest presence, the physical manifest presence of God comes, so that what he's saying is unmistakable. This isn't open to human interpretation, and this isn't like Job's best shot or whoever else's best shot trying to write down and understand what God said. This is actually what he said. Does that make sense? And therefore we kind of have to look at it and notice it and try and grapple with it and understand what he's saying and why he's saying it. So at verse 2 he says this, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Well, I think so far, until Elihu's appearance on the scene, we've had 30 odd chapters, and I think we're pretty tired by the end of those chapters and reached the conclusion that none of these guys actually know what they're talking about. They're just putting forward all their pet theories, and that's what God's saying. He said, like, you put forward all these pet theories, all these ideas, now you're going to listen to me. Now, when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, isn't that a bit unfair? Because, God, you haven't actually come on the scene till now. And how were these guys meant to know if you haven't actually told anybody? And why are you now picking on them? You know, why are you telling them that they've got it all wrong if you haven't given them a fair shot at getting it right? And, you know, I'm sorry, that's kind of the warped way my brain thinks. I like questions like this. And then it kind of, I thought about that for that a while. And I thought, well, what does that tell me about how God relates to us? Because that's really what we want to get at, isn't it? And I realized that it wasn't that God expected them to know things that they couldn't know, or nobody knew at that stage. What he expected them to do was appreciate that there was actually things that they didn't know, and that the things that they don't know make sense of what seemed to make no sense. I know that's a bit of a convoluted sentence. I'll try and say that again. That he expected them to appreciate there was things that they didn't know, and that those things they didn't know made sense of all the stuff that was going on that seemed to make no sense. In other words, God was saying that really what is I love and I enjoy is when my children respond in a way that says, I don't understand God, but I know that you understand, you know, and there is an explanation for all this, but it's based on information I don't have. But I'm not going to then take that lack of information and start accusing God, that you're a bad God and you're bringing bad things into my life. I'm just going to go and approach you on the basis, God, and maintain my relationship with you, that you are a good God. There's just things that I don't know, so I can't make sense of the situation I'm going through. Does that make sense to you? I know that's kind of a deep thought. I had that deep thought with a bowl of shreddies yesterday morning. So there you go. It was obviously the malted shreddies that got to me and made me think like that. Now that raises a question, doesn't it? That the ones that God criticizes are Eliphaz, Zophar, Bildad, and Job. He doesn't actually criticize Elihu. Now that again, I just want to clear this one up because it raises a question, doesn't it? Is everything that Elihu said absolutely right? And that's kind of a difficult question, isn't it? Because he claims to speak by inspiration from the Holy Spirit. But I think we need to remember that Elihu is a human being. And that whilst the overall picture of what he said was right, there might be some things in there that, you know, later when we reflect on it, we might think, well, I'm not sure about that or whatever. And that's like us today, isn't it? Because we can hear God, but sometimes what we hear gets filtered through our own understanding and our own ideas, and we kind of add to it and gloss it a bit and so on. And yet the fact still remains that God never comes and says Elihu was wrong. So we have to say, well, most of what Elihu said must have been right, or generally God didn't have a problem with it, because he doesn't come and criticize Elihu. So that gives us a bit of confidence that that stuff we've been looking at in the previous 2 or 3 weeks actually stacks up and God's happy with it. So are you still with me? So we should be thinking, well, okay, we're on the track now. We're getting some things right. This book's winding up and we're on pretty solid ground at knowing the stuff that we should be looking at, taking on board, and knowing the stuff that we shouldn't have looked at and we don't take on board. Does that make sense? Because that's really the problem with Job, isn't it? A lot of people take on board stuff that they shouldn't have taken on board. And so that's really helpful because God gives us a pointer, look here, but don't look at those guys because they don't know what they're talking about. And even if they get some of that stuff right, it's coming from a wrong attitude. Okay, so then God comes along and he says, I'm going to question you and you're going to answer me. Now, that's a really interesting statement because Job, if you remember, several times it demanded that God answer him. That I'm going to contend with God and I'm going to get God to answer me. And God comes along and he says, no. That's not how these things work. You're going to answer me. And so basically God's turning it the opposite way around, and he's going to say, right, okay, this is how I'm going to take you through this process. I'm going to lead you through to some understanding of what is going on. But we're not going to get there by you asking me questions from your lack of understanding. I'm going to give you some questions and give you some thoughts that come from my complete understanding. And one of the big issues I think, we saw with Job is that he had a real problem because he thought God had abandoned him. He thought God was distant, way off, not understandable, had a downer on him, wouldn't explain himself. And God, and he thought, well, there's just no way that God's going to come near. And then he started to have these revelations, didn't he, about that there's a mediator, there's a go-between, there's a redeemer, there's a ransom paid. And we see all those things. So right now, Job's in this position where he's seen all that stuff, and God's come along and he said, okay, I'm going to lead you through now so you can really see who I am. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to ask you some questions. And based on whether you can answer those questions or realize that you don't know how to answer those questions, will show you who I am. So a lot of people, and I heard it preached like this for years, whenever anything about Job was mentioned, people said, well, Job never got any answers. Well, he didn't in that sense, because he was asking God questions that God just wasn't going to answer because there were questions with prejudice. In reality, Job gets the answer he needs because God comes to him and shows him himself. And for the first time, Job says, now I see. Now I see what you're really like. And the way God does this is by asking Job a series of questions and showing him things in creation that should have led him to realize that God was good, that God cared, and that God was involved in the aspects of his life that were good, but that there was also things that Job can't understand, but he still needed to trust God in that God was a good God. And so that's kind of a bit of background. And there's a commentator, and I noted this down because I liked his name. He's called Smick, and I thought that was kind of cute, Smick. Anyway, this is what he said. Job learned that God had not abandoned him, and it dawned on Job that without knowing why he was suffering, he could face it as long as he was sure that God was his friend. So what God's going to do here is show Job, I'm your friend, I'm on your side. But there will be things that you won't always understand about your life, but that doesn't mean I've changed. It just means there's some things that you don't know. Because we're dealing with a big universe, a very complex universe. And right at this moment, Job, you don't even know you've got an enemy in that universe. Although he should have done, because somebody should have told him about Satan, shouldn't they? But I don't think he had an understanding of how Satan worked. Okay, so that's kind of my introduction, if that helps at all. This guy Smick, there's a second quote from him that I also like. Job was simply overwhelmed with mysteries and paradoxes for which he has no answers. But in the midst of all that, he came to understand what was too good to be told. That God knows what he's doing in God's own universe. So we've got Job realizing that God is with him and that he knows what he's doing. So even though Job can't understand every detail of how the universe works, he just has to understand God's with him and he knows what he's doing. And that's just the same for us today. All we really need in this life is to know that God's with us and he knows what he's doing. We put God first and we put our trust in him, as I've been saying on Sunday morning. And so let's go to verse 8. Well, I'll read verse 8 to 30. Who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth and went out of the womb? When I made the cloud its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and broke up for it my decree place, and set bars and doors, and said, this far you will come and no further, and here your waves will be stopped. Have you commanded the morning in your days, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? It is turned like clay by the seal, and it stands out as a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the high arm will be broken. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or have you walked in search of the depths? Well, no. The answer to all of this is no. I can't do these things, God. Have the gates of death been opened to you? Have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Have you perceived the breadth and the size of the earth? Come on, declare it if you know it all. Where is the path where light dwells? And as for darkness, where is its place? That you should take it to its boundary, and that you should know the path to its house. Do you know it because you were born then, or because the number of your days is many? Have you entered the treasuries of the snow, or have you seen the treasuries of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered upon the earth? Who's divided channel for overflowing waters, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on the earth where no man is, or on the wilderness in which there are no people, to satisfy desolate waste and cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth? Does the rain have a father, or who's produced the drops of dew? From whose womb came the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. Okay, so we get, that's just a series of questions that Job is going to go. I have no clue about how any of that works. I don't know why the sea stops where it does and the land finishes where it does. And I don't know why thunder and lightning come off where they do and they follow particular paths. And I don't know how the water carved these between the banks and why it stays in the banks and all those sort of things. And he's starting to realize, I don't know any of this. I don't understand any of this. So the question then becomes, God, are you going to tell me the answers to all that? And this is how God continues, verse 31. Can you tie the cords of the Pleiades or loosen the belt of Orion? He's talking about star constellations. Can you bring out the constellation in its season? Or can you guide the bear with its cubs? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? Can you set their dominion over the earth? So the first thing that God's really doing here is exposing Job's lack of knowledge. And sometimes we can get really overconfident, can't we? Just because we know a few things more than Job did, we think we know everything and we don't need God anymore. That's how man often relates to God these days. Well, I know lots of explanations for all sorts of stuff. But still, most of those questions there, man doesn't know the answer to. And what it impresses on Job is he hasn't got any answers for any of this, but he starts to realize how great and how powerful and how mighty and how wise God is. So what's the purpose of that? The purpose of it, God doing that, is to show Job and to show us we do not have the ability to control the world around us. And as a result, we do not have the ability to determine exactly how our life's going to pan out. Because we can't control all this stuff around us. So therefore, we have to put our trust in the only one who can do that. That's the point of what he's doing there, why he's saying this. And he says, who has put wisdom in the mind, or who has given understanding to the heart? Now, Job knows, and his friends know, because they've talked a lot about intelligence and wisdom and knowledge. So Job knows that man has some intelligence and he has some wisdom. But the point that God's making is, if you know you've got this intelligence and you know you've got wisdom, Where did it come from? And it's that same argument that very few people really want to face up to today, which is, if there's a creation, there's a creator. If there's wisdom, there's a source of wisdom. If there's intelligence, there's a source of intelligence. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, you know, you are designed, Job, by an intelligent designer, and you are not the product of random. Even this world around you is not controllable. You yourself are not the product of the randomness of that. There's something going on that you have been designed. You have intelligence, you have wisdom. You can relate to me because I designed you like that. And again, that's important for us today, because many people want to think that you are just a random collection of atoms with no meaning, no purpose, and nothing beyond 70 years on the earth, and that's it. It's just all meaningless. And that's what most people want you to be. But God's coming along and saying, if you've got wisdom, there's a giver of wisdom. If you've got intelligence, there's a giver of intelligence. If there's a creation, there's a creator. And it's me. I am the grand designer behind all this. So God's giving Job a revelation of himself as the great designer, the one who does have control in the universe, the one who is capable of sorting things out, the one who is capable of wisdom and intelligence in all its fullness. You still with me?
Yeah.
Because there's some quite deep things that God's coming out with here, as you would expect. And what's kind of interesting is that, strangely, some of these things that we're looking at tonight actually make a lot more sense to us now than they would have done to somebody 500 or 600 years ago, because we have these issues in much sharper focus. As a result of the, what's it called, Enlightenment thinking that came along in the 18th century, what happened there is that the Enlightenment exalted the idea of man's reason and wisdom as the ultimate measure of truth. And what God's doing here is he's saying that I'm destroying that idea that you can have that level of confidence in human wisdom. And if you look around you in creation, you will realize that that doesn't hold water. You are not the ultimate arbiters of truth. You don't have the level of wisdom and intelligence that's necessary to deal with all the things in life, and therefore you've got to come to me as creator. Because the Enlightenment basically said we don't need a creator, because human wisdom is really the ultimate measure of truth, and we decide what's right and wrong. We decide what we want to do. We decide what's good and bad, and nobody's going to tell us otherwise, because that's all there is. And God's saying, no, that's not all there is, because if you just look at creation, you realize you have no clue about how any of that happens, how that's formed. And so we kind of see that in perspective, and it wasn't really a problem for generations, hundreds and hundreds of years, until the Enlightenment. And then man comes along and says, I know better than you, God. And God's going, no, you don't. All your friends, Job, who thought they knew better than me, they didn't. Now you're listening to me, and I'm asking you questions, and you're going to answer me. And then he says, where are we at? Verse 33. Sorry, I've missed a couple of verses, but let's go on to verse 37. Who can number the clouds by wisdom, or who can empty out the bottles of heaven? When the dust turns into hard clumps and the clods stick together, will you hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite for the young lions? When they crouch in their dens and lie in the thicket to wait in ambush, who provides food for the who provides for the raven his food when his young ones cry unto God and they wander about for lack of food? And what's God saying there? He's saying, look, Job, you couldn't possibly manage all of this creation. And, you know, right at the start, man was given dominion over aspects of creation, if you remember, over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and all that sort of stuff. But man threw all that away. He threw away that authority by disobeying God. And so from that point on, man needed somebody else in order for creation to be able to provide what man needed. And that kind of comes back to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, when he's talking in the Sermon on the Mount, and he talks, you know, about, well, I'll look it up. Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. Look at the birds of the air, for they do not sow, nor do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much better than they? And that's just harking back to what he's just said to Job. I feed the birds. I provide for you know, when in all this chaos, when there's droughts and famines and all that sort of stuff, I find food for those who cry out to me. And so he's saying, I do the same thing for you, Job. I'm going to provide for you. I'm your provider, not you. And so let me just summarize what he just said in chapter 38. Number one, God is a God who has power beyond our ability to comprehend. Second, we cannot approach God on our terms. It has to be on his terms. We don't approach him on the basis of our goodness, but on the basis of his goodness. Third, it's not our place to demand answers from God in order to justify ourselves. We can ask God for answers, but if we come with the purpose of justifying our own position, then we don't get answers. Fourthly, God will answer, but it may not always be the answer we want, but it will be the answer we need. God understands much more about the operation of the world on an enormous and yet detailed scale than we would ever be capable of. God's made this world and this creation for a purpose. And angels, without exception, rejoiced in seeing it. They said it's good and perfect. And God made this creation not for himself, but for man. He placed man in this creation. So creation was made for man, but man did not make creation. And that means that humility should be our response, not pride. God is provider, God cares for us, and God will come to those who seek him out and cry out to him. So that's what we learn so far from what God said. Let's go on to chapter 39. Verses 1 to 4. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats produce offspring? So more questions. Can you observe when the deer gives birth? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they bring forth? They bow themselves, they bring forth their young ones, they get rid of their labour pains. Their young ones are healthy, they go strong with grain, they go forth and do not return to them. Here's the point here. Though Job doesn't really understand the natural order of things, though he hasn't got any comprehension really of how creation works, at the same time, God's putting him in a position where Job has to admit that despite the fact he doesn't understand it, it all seems to work pretty well. And these questions start to bring Job to another truth. And this is kind of a summary of it, that if I was putting it in Job's words, I see that this world made by God operates with order and wisdom. So can I deny his wisdom and government of all things just because there are things in my own life that I can't understand? Or should I simply trust this God who does all these things so amazingly well? And that again is a summary of why God's using this constantly talking about creation, because he's saying the evidence is there that despite the fact that you know, there's sin and death and all the stuff in the world, this stuff still works amazingly well. It's still self-correcting. It still works well. Yes, there's problems in it, but overall, it still works well. It's still in order, and it's kind of self-repairing in large parts. And so Job gets his question, you know, do I deny God because I can't understand everything? Or should I look at the evidence that said most things seem to work amazingly well without me and put my trust in God? That's how Job starts to get to this. Now, I used to talk a lot. I thought I knew, I used to hear, but now I see and now I understand. So he's starting to see these things that actually, and the way he's seeing them, he's looking at creation and God's asking him these questions. And it's forcing him to this place where he just has to say, God, even if I don't understand anything, I'm going to trust you because I can see you're doing a pretty good job with the universe. Let's just go on to verse 19 to 25 of that same chapter. Did you give the horse strength? Have you closed his neck with thunder? Can you make him afraid like a grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is awesome. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He goes on to meet the armed men. He mocks at fear, is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. The quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He devours the distance with fierceness and rage, and he does not stand still at the sound of the trumpet. At the sound of the trumpet, he says, aha, and smells the battle afar off, the thunder of captains and shouting. That's a really odd thing to just throw in there, isn't it? Let's just start talking about horses, Job, and I'm going to ask you, where does he get strength from? Who clothes him? And who gives him his fearlessness? Okay, well, they're fair questions. But then he talks about this horse rushing into battle and so on. And I said to God, I'm not really getting what you're saying here. So the best I can do in terms of the understanding I felt that I got was that God gives things in creation traits. So he gives the horses these certain traits, these certain qualities. But because man operates on the earth, we make the choices of how those traits and qualities are deployed. So a horse has strength, it has fierceness, it has courage, it's fast, it's quick, and yet we make the choice to take it to war. It's our choice. So what I understood that this was saying is there's all these things in creation, but whilst I've made all these things for man, ultimately you still have the choice of how these things are used for good or bad. And some of these things are used to make war instead of peace. Some of these things are used to bring harm instead of good. But that's man's choice. So we see not only the complexity of creation having been brought in, we now see that there's this other dynamic that God's starting to talk about, which is, and there's an interaction of all the choices of men as to how they use all this stuff that I put in creation. And some of it's going to be good and some of it's going to be bad. And you can't determine that either, can you, Job? You know, you can't make that happen. You can't decide that. You can decide for yourself, but you can't decide for mankind as a whole. And some of the things of other people's choices are going to affect you. (26 to 27). Does the hawk fly by your wisdom and stretch her wings towards the south? Does the eagle mount up at your command and make her nest on high? Even though man, right at the start, had been given dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle of the earth, every creeping thing, etc. Even though man had dominion over those, he wasn't responsible for the creation in which they were sustained. In other words, man could have input and dominion over the animals, but he didn't actually have authority over the whole of nature. Now, when I'm reading all these sort of things, you get this torrent of questions, and particularly when you read it quite quickly, like I've done tonight because we've got time constraints. When you look at all these things, it's very easy, I think, to get this impression and look at it, like I said right at the start of this series, is that how we read the word depends on our existing picture of God. So if we have a harsh picture of God, a judgmental picture of God, and we read these things, it comes across like a torrent of unanswerable questions and put downs from God aimed at Job. And that's, I think, how a lot of people read it. But if you have a picture of God as good and kind and wanting to help Job, what he's actually doing is he's leading him through a path that takes him from all the stuff that his accusers had said and all the stuff that these wise people, supposedly wise people around him had said. And he's teaching him that there are things that he can't control, things that he doesn't have authority over, things that he can't predict, and therefore he needs God. So what I see in this is I see God saying, this is the magnificence of the creation that I have made for man. And despite the fact that it got flawed, and despite the fact it was messed up, and despite the fact there's sin in the world, if you walk this with me, you can still enjoy life. You can still relate to me, and you can be confident because you have me with you. Does that make sense? Give me a nod or a wave or a shake of the head or something. Okay. There's a commentator, and one of the things he said is, I find it exasperating that God never gives Job the reasons for his ordeal. Sorry, if we find it exasperating that God never gives Job the reasons for his ordeal. Remember, I said that I'd heard that said a lot of times, that God never answers Job. So if we find it exasperating that God never gives Job reasons for his ordeal, then we have entirely missed the point of these final chapters. And I think when people who taught me that, I think they'd missed the point. This is a commentator called Mason. And while it's true that the Lord's answer to Job is neither logical nor theological, that's not the same as saying he gives no answer. God absolutely does give Job an answer. The answer is himself. I am what you need, Job. Because you can't control this, you can't understand this. So God's leading Job to the point where he realizes, I can't answer any of these questions, but God's the answer. I just need God. God is the only thing that makes sense of life. And he's the only source of reliable wisdom. He's the only source of reliable guidance. And he's the only one who's got any power to do anything about anything. So God gives Job an answer, and the answer is, I am the answer, Job. Are you getting this? Because I think that's really important. Because so many times I've heard it said God never gives him an answer, and he does. But the point is that God is the answer. He's pointing him all the time to himself. I am all you need. And there's a commentator called Bradley, and he says this: one thought and one only is brought into the foreground. The world is full of mysteries, strange, unapproachable, overpowering mysteries that you cannot read. Trust in the power and in the wisdom and in the goodness of him, the Almighty One, who is able to rule over it. So once again, we look and we go, okay, God is the answer. That's where we put our trust. When nothing makes sense, we still put our trust in God because we know who he is. And because we know we can do something about it. So I'll just summarize that chapter. 1, the natural order of creation and the way it works show us that God is a God of order. He's not random. Remember, that was a big question early on in Job. Is God just random and does things depending on which side of the bed he's got out of? One day he's happy, one day he's got a downer on me, etc., etc. Secondly, creation shows God to be wise. And even if we don't always understand everything, we can know he understands everything and he's working on it, and he's asking us therefore to trust him because he's trustworthy. Thirdly, nature is essentially uncontrollable and has unseen effects. Fourth, man makes choices and puts natures to uses which may cause good or may be harmful. They may be bad. In this world that is much bigger than man, man cannot expect to have control over everything or even many things that happen to him. You know, lots of people think, well, I'm Christian, everything should be absolutely perfect, and, you know, my sky should be sunny every day, and the money should just appear in my bank account, and life should be hunky-dory. Well, the world's not like that, and that's what God's saying. You can't, this is not where we are. And God's plan in all of that is that God himself is always enough for us. God himself is always enough for us. Let's go on to chapter 40. Verses 1 to 2. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, will he who argues with the Almighty instruct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. That's God going back to his initial challenge to Job, which is, you wanted me to enter into an argument with you, Job, and you wanted me to justify myself to you, and you rebuked me, God, Job, but now I'm going to ask you to answer some things, some more things. And he says this, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? And if you remember, Job in the early chapters, he was speaking from this, what he felt was his God-absent agony. And he just wanted to tell God what he thought of him. And yet now God's appeared and he started to show him about creation, showing him some things about that. And he's shown him his goodness. He's shown him, he's appeared physically, manifest presence. His glory is there. And what God's saying is, now I've got you in a place where I can actually talk to you, Job, because now you're humble. So now you'll actually hear what I'm saying and you'll understand. Because before, when you were proud, even if I told you this, even if we'd not gone through all this process for 40 chapters, you would not have got it. But now that you are humble, now you'll understand. God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. That's why humility is so important to us. You know, we live in a generation that almost idolizes giftedness in the church. It's worse than, I don't know, it's worse than Britain's Got Talent, really. We kind of have this idolization of giftedness, but God always consistently, right through the word, points us that giftedness is not the big thing. Humility is the big thing. Integrity is the big thing. Character is the big thing. And it's just so much more important on God's scale than giftedness. Yeah, God gives the giftedness, but no character is bad news. And it's important we remember that, because we've kind of often found ourselves being like the world and putting all these amazing people up and paying hundreds of pounds to go and see them because they're the big name. And somehow we need to remember that this is actually, I'm not criticizing those people. I'm actually saying what is our motivation in that? What's our thinking? Have we put giftedness above character? And have we downplayed the value of character in the body? And do we need a corrective there? And I think the biggest aspect of that, two biggest really, are love and humility, which are just so important. And then Job comes out with a classic thing, which I just want to explain before I kind of show you a couple of things, because these are kind of interesting, these couple of things I want to show you, but I just want to show you something else first. So when you get into verse 3 to 5 of chapter 40, Job answered the Lord. So this is Job speaking from humility now, okay? Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I'm putting my hand over my mouth because I've spoken once, so I'm not going to even attempt to answer. In fact, I probably talked more than once, but I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just going to sit and listen, God. And I just think that's brilliant. But the bit I like, and the bit I think is kind of a bit misunderstood, is I've just read you what is the modern English version, but that hasn't changed since the King James version, that word. And the word I'm talking about is, behold, I am vile. And is that how you're meant to see yourself? Behold, I am vile. I mean, do you get up in the, well, maybe I do. I sometimes get up in the morning, look in the mirror, and my head's gone wild. And it's even worse at the moment. I'm practicing my Bojo look. And I can't get an appointment till the end of April, even at the hairdressers and all that stuff. I'm looking at it and they go, perhaps sometimes I do think that's pretty vile. I can't take that early in the morning. But we don't generally want to see ourselves as vile, do we? Now, here's the point. Now, I could go on about that and I could say, well, we're just miserable worms, and compared to God, we're filthy, we're always sinners, we're terrible. And that's how a lot of people just read that and they go, okay, well, that's what it means. Now, at the time that the King James Version was written, and a lot of the translations still follow that.
Mine doesn't.
What's yours say? Yours New King James, is it?
No, mine is the English Standard Version, and it says, behold, I am of small account. That's
it. So the ESV gets it right then, because at the time of the King James, that word vile, how many of you got vile in your translations? Yeah. It didn't mean then what it does now. In the Hebrew word that it's translating, there is no suggestion at all of moral failure or filthiness. What it means literally is, I am of no weight compared to you, God. So Job's not confessing in the presence of God some sort of moral perversity and looking at all his sins. What he's saying is, compared to you, God, I'm insignificant. So now I really realize I need to listen and just put my hand over my mouth and stop talking all the nonsense I've been coming out with and listen to you. That's what that said. I just want to explain that because quite a few times I've heard people that say, until you see yourself as vile, you don't really know how sinful you are. And it's kind of their goal to get you confessing that. And that's not actually what that phrase means at all. Yes, we are insignificant compared to God, but isn't that amazing how much he loves us, despite the fact that he is so incredible and we're so tiny, that he's still interested in us. Okay, so I'm going to kind of let me just do one more verse and I'll show you something. Well, I'll show you a couple of things. Verse 14, it says, well, I'll start 13. Hide them in the dust together and imprison them in the hidden place of God. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. Basically, what God says is, if you could do all these things, he goes through several things. If you could do all these things, that I do, Job, then I'll agree with you that you could save yourself. But as you can't, you're going to have to rely on me to save you, because I'm the only one that can do all these things. And then he gives two examples. Now, here's what I want to show you. Just don't worry about this. And if you think I'm being controversial or whatever, just ignore what I'm going to say. Okay, and what I'm going to show you. But I just want to show you that there's two creatures that God's going to talk about now that Job, now remember Job lives after Abraham but before Moses, after the flood, etc. Job clearly knows what creatures he's talking about. Just like to point out, and he's going to call one Behemoth and the other Leviathan. And he talks about them in a way that man should seem to recognize what he's talking about. I haven't really got time to read the verses, but let's just look at Behemoth first, and I'll show you something. Look now at Behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox, so he's a grass eater. He's got strength in his hips. Power is in the muscles of his belly. He's got a tail like a cedar. Sinews of his thighs are wrapped together, and his bones are like strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. And then he goes on and describes he lies under shady trees. He finds shade in the trees. The mountains bring forth food for him, etc., etc. He's not alarmed by high tides and rivers overflowing the banks because he's so big. Now, people look at that, and the traditional interpretation of that is that is, well, some people have said it's an elephant, but most people have now settled on that when God's talking about Behemoth, given that Job recognizes that as a real creature, it's not some mythical creature, people say, well, it's a hippopotamus. It's a hippopotamus. I'm just going to show you a little video, and I'm going to leave you to make your own mind up. I'm going to show you a video where the actual person's actually made their own mind up, so that should help you. But let's have a look at what a behemoth might look like. Okay, I'm going to screen share, so I'll disappear. You got that? Yeah. Okay.
The awe-inspiring behemoth described in Job chapter 40 has left so many of us to wonder just what exactly this creature could be. The word behemoth is literally a plural form of a common Old Testament word meaning beast. Practically all translators and commentators have agreed that this word is an intensive or majestic plural, so that the meaning is something more like colossal beast. Though many have suggested that the behemoth is an elephant or hippopotamus, neither of these animals really fit the description, especially in regards to its tail. It's hard to imagine how the unassuming tail of an elephant or hippo could ever be compared to a cedar. But if the behemoth isn't an elephant or hippo, then what exactly is it? The reality is that there is no known living animal that adequately fits the description. And when we consider that roughly 150 to 200 species of plant, insect, bird, and mammal become extinct every 24 hours, it becomes apparent that the animals alive today represent only a small fraction of those living in Job's day. Interestingly, if we look to the fossil record, we do find some massive beasts worthy of such descriptions. We know them today as dinosaurs. And of particular interest here is the sauropod type, sporting massive bones easily comparable to bars of iron, as well as enormous cedar-like tails. This subgroup of the lizard-hip dinosaur is a real possibility. Of course, this conclusion absolutely flies in the face of conventional wisdom, which separates dinosaurs and man by more than 65 million years.
Okay, well, make your own mind up. Is it hippo? Or did dinosaurs survive a bit longer than we thought they did? Or is God just talking rubbish? And then let's have a look at this guy called Leviathan. Verse chapter 41. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you let down? Can you put a cord into his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak soft words to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him for a servant forever? Will you play with him as a bird or put him on a leash for your maidens, etc., etc.? And then it goes on. Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle, you will do it no more. Notice any hope of overcoming him is in vain. Shall not one be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that it deserves to stir him up. Who's able to stand before me? Then on to verse 12. I'll not conceal his limbs, nor his powerful, nor his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer garment, or who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the jaws of his face because his teeth are terrible all around? His scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They're joined to each other and they stick together that they cannot be separated. His sneezing flashes forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth goes burning light, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goes smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindles coal, and a flame goes out of his mouth. In his neck remains strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. Folds of his flesh are joined together, they are firm on him and cannot be moved, and his heart is as firm as a stone, yes, as hard as a piece of the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, even the gods are afraid because of his crashings, they are beside himself. The sword that reaches him does not avail, nor does the spear. And then he continues and he says, he makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of iron. It leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him, a creature made without fear. He beholds all high things and is king over the children of pride. Okay, so what's that? Is this a mythical creature, or are we supposed to understand it is a real creature? That's the first question. And if it's a real creature, what is it? And if it's a real creature, it's got to be able to swim in the sea, and it's got to be able to walk through mud and on land. And it's got lots of teeth around its mouth. So that's why most people conclude that's a crocodile. And I'll just show you a bit again. You might think this is controversial and I've lost my trolley, but I'll show you this. And I'll leave you to make your own mind up.
While the book of Job is categorized as a book of poetry, Job chapter 41 vividly describes in scary detail a monumental monster of the sea known as Leviathan. If this Leviathan is indeed a real creature, as the text seems to indicate, and as I firmly believe, then it's worth exploring the fossil record for some possibilities. Based upon such a description, some believe that some of the now extinct marine reptiles, such as Kronosaurus, Mosasaurus, Shawnosaurus, or Styxosaurus, would make good candidates. The sizes of their body and their bite certainly make them worthy possibilities. Indeed, these mammoth sea monsters ranged in size from 30 to 50 feet in length, weighed up to 10 tons, and all sported massive jaws and teeth. There is, however, one detail regarding Leviathan, which doesn't seem to fit the behavior of such sea dwellers. Job 41:30 tells us that this animal often left a trail in the mud, like a threshing sledge. It's hard to imagine a sea-dwelling creature spending time in the mud, and this may be one of the reasons why many commentators identify Leviathan with the common crocodile. Not only do these semi-aquatic reptiles like to spend time in the mud, but the scales on their backs could rightly be described as rows of shields. However, while they do make for difficult hunting, they are nevertheless successfully caught on a daily basis. But God makes it absolutely clear that Leviathan was uncatchable. But all may not be lost. Discovered in 1964 in the Sahara Desert was a fossil of a colossal crocodile, which they dubbed Sarcosuchus, meaning flesh-eating crocodile. This super croc was as long as a school bus, and when alive, would have weighed up to 8 tons. This is twice as large as the largest crocs living today, which certainly puts it in a vastly different league. As with Leviathan, its 6-foot-long mouth was also ringed about with fearsome teeth, more than 100 in fact, which one researcher described as railroad spikes. And the scutes, or scales of this killer croc, were each about a foot long, closely overlapping one another, just like Leviathan's rows of shields tightly sealed together. Another fascinating feature is a round bony protrusion in the tip of its snout, which housed a large bowl-shaped cavity called a bulla. Scientists aren't sure what function it served, but could it have had something to do with the production of smoke and fire? Is the description of Leviathan as a fire breather merely poetic? One thing we do know from the bombardier beetle, which can ignite a lethal chemical spray up to 100 degrees Celsius, is that such a feature is biologically possible. So is Sarcosuchus the dreaded Leviathan? God only knows.
Okay, so why do I show you those things? I show you those things not necessarily to convince you of any particular scientific theory or whatever, but I show you them because people often will laugh and say, well, that's just rubbish, it's just, this is all poetic and therefore we can dismiss the whole thing, we can get rid of the whole book because it's just a whole load of nonsense. Look, it's got things in there that don't exist. Well, that depends whether you want to find whether they exist or not, I think. I don't know if any of you are familiar with bombardier beetles, but they produce kind of a chemical and they can spray it and it ignites. And so that's what they're suggesting here. I think bombardier beetles are unique in creation in being able to do that now. But what they're saying is God's describing something that does that same sort of thing, only it's much bigger. I think it's important that when we're faced with stuff that looks like it's strange or not real or whatever, that we start from the point that the Bible is actually correct and that these things are there and they can be found. And then maybe that leads us to have to rethink some of the things we've always thought. I'm not trying to persuade anybody one way or the other. I know what I think. But the point is that when God said this and Job heard it, Job knew what he was talking about. And so I think it's important that we appreciate that there are possibilities and ideas that actually do fit this description, rather than saying that it's just, fiction. So I'm going to stop there and we'll come back next week for the final one of these sessions.